Hi, my name is Hanna Rosin. I'm an editor at Double X and Slate, and a contributing writer at The Atlantic, and I'm here with Maureen Tkacik in New York. Hi, Mo.
Hi, Hanna.
Hi. Since Mo is newbie to Blogging Heads, I will host this particular session. We're going to talk about M.I.A., who's a pop star who's being profiled in the Times Magazine this week, and then Joe McGinnis, the journalist who is moving next door to Sarah Palin, who's bought the house next door to Sarah Palin, and then finally we will talk about the fabulously awful Sex and the City movie. So, let's start with M.I.A. Just to briefly summarize the Times Magazine article, so Lynn Hirschberg, who's a great profiler of grand celebrities, in this profile, I think, and Mo, you can agree with me or disagree, is trying to kind of display the incoherence of M.I.A.'s radical politics. Mo, do you want to just do a little explanation of kind of who M.I.A. is, like where she's from? She's Sri Lankan. Like, what exactly is her politics, as you can tell from this story?
Her politics seems to be pretty superficial, I think, the way that as Lynn Hirschberg described it, it's not particularly coherent, although I don't actually know that Lynn Hirschberg's own politics are probably much more coherent, because the it's cutting, and it's sort of funny and arch the way that she describes her as wanting war or wanting revolution and celebrating the Tamil Tigers, for instance, because she's Tamil herself, with no regard for
I mean, it seems
the carnage, etc. And I don't know. I think that M.I.A. is a pop star, and pop stars very rarely have particularly coherent politics.
Right. I mean, it seems to me there's two strains of kind of hypocrisy that come out in the story, or what Lynn Hirschberg is trying to describe as hypocrisy. One is that M.I.A. lives this really, really posh lifestyle, but is sort of portraying herself as more revolutionary than she is. So, there'll be sentences like, "I want war," she says, while eating a truffle-scented French fry, right? That's like a loose quote. And then there's another strain, which is like, does M.I.A. know what she's getting into by glamorizing the Tamil Tigers, that she's doing something actually dangerous, thinking it's like, it's one way to sort of build her own controversial image, but she's actually like playing with fire because she's glamorizing something that's like a horrible movement. She's throwing around words like genocide, and all these things are like, dangerous, say various Sri Lankan humanitarian experts.
Right.
Like the
seems pretty dubious that M.I.A. was actually having an impact on, Sri Lankan politics. I didn't see any proof of that, although there were some quotes to that effect. But it seemed a little preposterous to me. Although the world is preposterous, and I would believe just about anything these days if there was any evidence. But I never thought that made any sense.
Right. You also can't really have it all ways, right? Like, the first argument is that she's a phony, and the second argument is that she's too radical. Right. So in a way, like, is she a phony? I don't know. Like, she's really comes from, like, she grew up in a housing project in South London. Like, she was pretty poor. Her father actually was involved in the Tamil rebel movement. It was like a precursor called improbably Eros, or at least EROS. And so, so she does have this, and the idea that she's now posh is like, what pop star from the dirt doesn't want to wear a lot of bling? Like, that seems to me like a pretty natural kind of trajectory to make in one's life. It used to be we criticized these rap stars because they were pretending they were so, like, street, but in fact, they were from, like, some posh suburb. But that's not exactly who she is. She's not from some posh suburb.
No.
And again, we usually, is she incoherent? Like she says, like, I'm sick of peace, I believe in war. Like, I don't know, is that incoherent? Maybe it's incoherent. Can you describe the video that you were just watching? Because that video actually seems to me very anti-war, so that
I didn't watch it all the way through, which is sort of I feel really culturally irrelevant. But to me, everything that she did, anyway. Everything that she seems to be saying and doing in that story seems to me to be playing with imagery and playing with, she's deliberately provocative. photo shoot that she describes with her sort of, just surrounded and by gold.
Right.
Seemed to me to be pretty interesting. I wanted to see those pictures. I wanted to, I thought that, there's, on one hand, it's almost like Lynn Hirschberg is trying to ascribe to her the importance and the hypocrisy of some sort of, sellout dictator or sellout communist, sort of, like vilifying wealth and vilifying the West, while, sort of indulging in all of its, in all of its luxuries. And, that seems to be, she seemed a really silly target for that kind of lame and, classic critique. Especially since...
Why so?
Well, because she's an artist, and so she's sort of playing with that dichotomy already, it seemed,
Right, right.
And it didn't seem, aside from having her baby in a private room of Cedars-Sinai, unlike, and not doing it at home as she had planned, that was really the biggest luxury that I saw her indulge in that piece.
Right.
Truffle French fries. Shit, I can afford those some days,
Except, well, the other thing is who she's marrying, because she's marrying a Bronfman's son. So I guess, that's, I don't know, we all love who we love, but, like, she is entering, not that she wasn't entering the big leagues on her own, but, like, she's entering a padded and protected life, no matter what happens to her career. She's marrying Ben Bronfman.
Yeah.
But is that a contradiction? I mean, that's the hard part. It's like you said, like, she's an artist. So, so there's sort of a little bling in there and a little war in there. And, I don't know. I don't know. I mean, what she seems to me to have is, like, the kind of delusion of the expat. My family are Israeli expats. I mean, just the idea that, like, you are more radical than radical because you're not actually in the country. So you can be like, the same people wear Che t-shirts, right? Like, she's basically wearing, like, at the end of the piece, she's actually playing with the equivalent of the Che t-shirt. She's deciding whether she should sort of dress
as a tiger, or would that be a joke, Again, it's all imagery that I don't know how sort of powerful or useful it is to her audience. I don't know if she's gotten people interested in politics and movements and struggles that they wouldn't otherwise be interested in. I think it's possible.
Right.
I mean, she's certainly
right.
But she's playing with what exists, which is a very vacuous landscape, a pop cultural landscape to begin with. And so,
right.
I don't know. I think that M.I.A is interesting. I love her music. She's just got a great eye. And like they say, she's a really good curator. The thing that was most damning in that profile to me was likening Lady Gaga to ABBA. And just the relentless sort of hateration on Lady Gaga, which seemed that seemed silly. I wouldn't. I was sort of disappointed that M.I.A wasn't more encouraging of Lady Gaga, who I think is incredibly interesting and way more musically talented than M.I.A in a kind of in a traditional way. In the kind of she's more classically trained, and her lyrics are very funny, and
right.
I think that she makes like falafel stand music, but it's interesting, and
I like that falafel stand music.
Well,
I actually prefer M.I.A.'s music, but I hear what you're saying. I mean, it's like there's more to it.
Like my sensibility.
But here's that is a really interesting thing. You do get the sense that like it's really a truly hilarious rivalry, right? Because they occupy sort of like such a similar space, but you do get the impression that like actually like M.I.A. gets more riled up about like a Lady Gaga success than she does about like a Tamil, you know, that like that makes her more animated than, you know, the success or failure of the Tiger.
Right. And I guess what it's to me, you know, I think that when people are sort of that people who indulge in things like jealousy and revenge, I think that those are, you know, and are motivated by those things. That sort of turns me off to them. But M.I.A. has great taste. That is her. That's her appeal. That is how she, you know, that is why she's so compelling.
Do you mean aesthetically, or just like in the way that she's kind of a multicultural mixer, like a natural kind of, you know?
Yeah, I mean, I think aesthetically, like, she knows how. Look, she can make anything. M.I.A. can make anything really badass and cool, you know. And I think that the fact that she, but the idea that she would liken Lady Gaga to ABBA seems to me to be, you know, if she really thinks that, maybe her taste isn't as good as I thought.
That is really low. On the other hand, I bet you read that there was a great New York Magazine profile of Lady Gaga, and I bet you read that and was like greatly pleased that Gaga actually comes from such a normal place, right? Like she definitely wins on the biography, right? Because she's like, you know, she's got this rebel father, and they dragged over here from Sri Lanka, and then she lives in a housing project, and she's so multicultural, and like, you know, here Lady Gaga's like comes from a perfectly normal American suburb and has basically had to like wrench herself into eccentricity and otherness, you know, which M.I.A. comes by it naturally.
Well, I mean, that's sort of, it's...
And it looks like M.I.A. is more willing to be just, like, sexy, too, in this perfectly straightforward way, as opposed to, like, a weird, transgendered kind of, you know, transvestite-y way. I don't know.
I mean,
I think
that Lady Gaga, see, this is another thing. I think Lady Gaga is pretty cute, and, like, she definitely does a lot of weird things, but, you know, I kind of give her credit for, but I don't think that eccentricity is something that, I don't think that people should really be congratulated for or celebrated for their biographies so much. So that's sort of where I'm like, yeah, you know, Lady Gaga actually, you know, it's a lot odder coming from this sort of Catholic schoolgirl. And I also found that did you ever see the Barbara Walters interview with Lady Gaga?
No, I never watched that.
It's really interesting because I don't know. Throughout the course of the interview, Barbara Walters at the end she ends it by saying, "Lady Gaga, you're much different from how I expected you. You're so much more,
right.
You know." And I think that, I think that is, you know, I think that there's just a lot there, and she's just, you know, I would rather listen. I would rather there be more music in the world like M.I.A.'s than Lady Gaga's. I think, but I'm pretty sure that Lady Gaga is going to have a more interesting career. Because
she's so like mindful. Mindful's not the right word. That's like a yoga word. I mean, like she's so like she is in control of what she is putting out there in her
and
own
it is
image.
her.
It doesn't feel so like haphazard and accidental. It's like she's like on top of.
Well, yeah,
it,
she writes it. I mean, she started out as a songwriter. She's totally a drama geek. She's musically very sound. Her songs,
right.
The reason that they stick, even though you're like, oh, this is terrible pop, is because there's these flourishes in there that she has learned from the canon. She's also an artist. I mean, I got obsessed for a while with her fascination with Rilke. She has a tattoo from excerpted from Letters to a Young Poet. And she's really serious about it. And if you look at Rilke's life, he was really serious about art. And so, you know, she sort of, I just don't think that she's vacuous. And M.I.A. Has an element of vacuousness to her. But it's a fashion-oriented thing. You know, fashion is superficial. And And I don't think that, so I don't really think, I mean, war, especially in the sort of super impoverished areas of the world that M.I.A. is sort of trying to shine a light on, war is not an answer. War is a sort of capitulation. But, you know, there's a lot of people for whom it's the only answer. So I don't really think that, like, I don't think that it's fair to criticize M.I.A.'s politics because Lynn Hirschberg certainly doesn't have the frickin' answer to what ails Sri Lanka. But I also don't think that it goes a whole lot deeper than what she has depicted.
No, that's a really good point. And actually, you made me see the Born Free video as I'm thinking about it. It's not anti-war. It's her other kick, which is actually completely different, which is a more sort of like our latest narcissistic kick, which is anti-censorship. It's like, you know, she wants to do this anti-censorship tour. It's just basically like a don't mess with me and, like, give me my freedom, which is not exactly, you know, anti-war. So it's all fairly superficial. Anyway, okay, let us move on to our next topic, which is a topic dear to our journalist hearts, which is whether or not Joe McGinnis was, you know, A, fine, B, creepy, like C, unethical, I guess, or maybe your choices, for buying the house next door to Sarah Palin.
Now,
Sarah Palin.
He bought the house?
It's kind of amazing. Apparently he sort of, you know, he did one of these, like, private, nonprofit auctions to have, like, lunch with her. And then he, and then he rented, do I have that wrong? Did he buy or rent the house?
I think that he's renting the house. I don't think that...
He's renting the house.
Yes, he won apparently, the eBay auction.
Know, one of the rumors was that... What?
He won the eBay auction. To dine with Palin for... $63,500.
And one of the things was that it was like spiteful neighbors. It was like, you know, annoyed neighbors knew they were giving the house to a snooping journalist.
Right. And to me, you know, I mean, that's...
Would you do it?
Absolutely. If you know, why has Palin pissed off her neighbors so much that they want to rent out the house to an unsympathetic journalist? And I think that unsympathetic journalists, in the case of the Palins, isn't that almost redundant? You know, who's a real journalist has a whole lot of sympathy for Sarah Palin, who's a mendacious, cynical, opportunistic...
But, I mean, do you think it's like a publicity stunt? Like, this is a way to kind of signal to the world, like, I'm so serious, like, everybody's going to be heard of my book, and now you'll all buy my book? Like, is this just kind of like a commercial move? Or do you think it's like a move with journalistic integrity and kind of authenticity?
I don't know how the initial leak got out. Now, my sense is that that sort of blog hype that, you know, generates 100,000 page views in, you know, over the 1 hour period, months before, you know, or sometimes years before the book actually comes out. I mean, hype doesn't really seem to translate into book sales. It's almost like something that but it's not an option. You kind of have to generate it. No, but I think that it was journalistically sound because, you know, hanging around, one of my old friends who's a really great writer, Evan Wright, used to say that, you know, the key to his success, he did a lot of, he's won 2 National Magazine Awards for Rolling Stone and Vanity Fair, and but when I met him, he was just coming out of porn. He was an editor at Hustler for a long time. And he was, you know, he was kind of working really hard to sort of become a legitimate journalist, and Rolling Stone was sending him all these kind of like weird, fringy assignments. And, you know, he was just like, yeah, I'm not really good at this. You know, I don't have a lot going for me in terms of training, but I am willing to hang out for as long as it takes.
Right.
And,
right.
and I think that's underrated, because even if you are thinking constantly, as you are in those situations, oh, Jesus Christ, what am I getting? I'm wasting my time. I'm just, sitting around and procrastinating, basically. And reporting, and it is procrastination in a lot of senses. But I think that you do invariably get something. And
yeah, I mean, that's why I admired it. Like, I really don't think I could do it, because there is fundamentally a part of me that does think it's sort of different to actually kind of move into someone's, home space that way. It's like more than I think I could bring myself to do, because I sort of valued the idea that somebody would have no peace, like no peace at night, no peace in the morning, no peace to get the newspaper. It's just like, it's disturbing to me. On the other hand, as a kind of like blow for, like, as a sort of like cry for immersion journalism, which, nobody even knows what that term means anymore. Like,
right.
People blog, like their reporting exists of, the mainstream media. And like, it seems to me just the fact that he was like geographically like hauling himself
right.
to a specific place to get what the blogs call, color. He's just doing it for a few bits of color. Well, that, color is reporting, right? That's how you figure stuff out. You're like, you kind of like weave your way into the neighborhood. You sort of pick up little bits of this and that, which you then follow through. Like, that's actually how reporting happens.
And in order to understand where the Palins are coming from, I mean, like I say, unsympathetic. In order to get any sympathy or understanding of where Sarah Palin's coming from, where her family's coming from, where how she sort of fits into the ecosystem of Alaskan politics and culture. You got to spend a lot of time there. It's sort of, that is absolutely, I think it would be absolutely useful. And a lot of reporting
and actually,
is gratuitous,
Right.
Right. But also, in terms of the privacy and kind of invasiveness idea of it, I just think, pretty much anywhere in the world, anywhere you could live in the world, is just naturally more invasive than Wasilla. It's probably, I think, which is to say,
what do you mean by that?
Like, it's just more crowded.
Right.
And I think that kind of feeds into it. If the Palins lived in New York City, and you took, how many yards away from her house is this guy actually going to be living, So
right.
transplant that distance into Manhattan, and you've got, and it wouldn't be called invasive at all,
Right, right.
And I think that is sort of, the sort of luxury, but also the disconnectedness that you get from other people living in a place like Wasilla, Alaska, is, I think, sort of inextricable from her worldview, whatever it is.
Right.
Not to sound...
Right, and so maybe out of his... I mean, I think one thing... I just want to emphasize one thing you say. Like, I think the bummer about immersion journalism for a naturally antagonistic, subject and writer is that you invariably wind up more sympathetic, or at least more empathetic, if not more liking, because, in his very frustrations not to be able to peek into her yard, like, that alone will be like a revelation about what life is like and sort of where her kind of, her streak of independence. Like, in fact, like the choice to live in Wasilla actually does say something about a person and, what their philosophies end up being and what kind of life they want to lead. And like, you start to understand it in some kind of local context, and then it actually becomes more difficult to kind of demonize and make fun of it. So,
yes, I think that, I think that's absolutely true. Every time I've set out to write about somebody that I wasn't naturally sympathetic to, I came around for whatever reason or another. And I think that fundamentally most journalists who are really, who have the right intentions, don't set out to destroy people or, invade. But I also think that privacy is something that, we talk a lot about, but we don't know what we really expect.
Right.
And we don't, like, privacy is, I think, like with the Facebook controversy right now.
Right.
Privacy and self-promotion, are at odds. And who is more self-promotional than Sarah Palin? Lady Gaga, maybe. But so it's sort of like, well, no, you don't actually, and what our rights to privacy are anyway in this country is a very tricky thing. But
wait, this is a really interesting point. So, is your point about Sarah Palin that you think that she, like, who's learning the lesson here, like us or her or him? Because that isn't it. Like, she actually sort of responded with a kind of grace and fatalism to. I'm sorry, that was my cat's tail on my face. She responded with a kind of grace and like, welcome to the neighborhood, because is that a moment where she's recognizing that, like, in all this self-promotion, that self-promotion and privacy are at odds, and so she's just going to have to suck it up?
I hope so. I mean, I would like for Sarah Palin to get more to become more self-aware.
Right.
Since it seems like she's sticking around. But yeah,
right.
I mean, she's savvy in that she knows that. I don't think that, and I don't think that her base is fired up about privacy. Gets fired up about privacy the way that they might get fired up about abstinence or any of her other major causes.
Really? See, I think they are.
I mean,
I think it's sort of the leave my government alone is having this, like, surprising kind of, unbelievable resurgence that's hard to really put your finger on why or,
I mean, yes, no, that's true. In as much as it's tied up in the idea of this, Big Brother, healthcare reform stuff,
right?
And it also plays into her kind of, the victim complex that she has cultivated, and
I have to say, Mark Lilla, for all the listeners, wrote a great piece in the New York Review of Books. It was the best piece I have read, sort of explaining this resurgence and what it means, and sort of, he gets into sort of what the various people, it's a piece about the Tea Party movement, but it talks about, it tries to explain what all these kind of disparate strains mean, how they're not exactly sort of social issues, but they're these sort of government off my back issues, and they seem contradictory, but he puts them in a kind of context of a sort of growing, belief in her own sort of fabulousness, basically. Like, imagine, it's like it's a sort of national narcissism. It's very interesting.
Oh, yeah, I mean, I would agree with that. I haven't read that. I've thought a lot about the Tea Party and what it, what it means.
Yeah.
But
well, you should read it. It's very interesting.
I'll put it on the syllabus.
Okay, so let's move on
to Sex and the City.
Ahead. Do you want to say one more thing about this?
No. I mean, probably,
okay.
but now I'm thinking about Lawrence of My-Labia.
Lawrence of My-Labia. Yes, we're going to move on to sexual revolution. From the Tamil rebels to the sexual rebels. We are, of course, talking about the Sex and the City 2 movie, which has been kind of, maybe universally panned. But anyway, there's many issues to talk about in the movie. And the basic plot of the
universally panned. However,
However, millions and millions of women will see it. And I should never admit this in public, but the two people I saw it with were just kind of like, could not believe the dreadfulness of it. And I personally did not feel that way. Like, there were moments that I, could watch and not feel horrified. So anyway, that's where I stand. But what happens in this movie is that the ladies go to Abu Dhabi, and, the reason that they take this junket to Abu Dhabi,
I've been wondering
as a kind of plot narrative is because, their idea of sort of dating in New York, being sexually free in New York, they sort of run through that idea. Carrie's married, the two of them have kids, and so it's not so interesting for them to kind of replay that idea over and over again. But if they take it to the Middle East, then basically what happens is that message becomes fresh again. So it's basically, you have Samantha, the libertine, like, against the kind of fundies. There's sort of masses of kind of fundies in this movie, angry, sweaty men who are completely horrified by, bra strap, leg, shoulder, like Samantha's general kind of like, outrageously over-sexed behavior. So the question is, once again, we get this idea that, like, those are your choices. Like, it's just a kind of affirmation of this notion of feminism as kind of extreme sexual liberation. And so talk about that as an idea.
And shopping.
Yes.
Feminism and shopping are inextricable. So I saw, the other day, I was in a deli, and there was a woman buying a bouquet of flowers that was really beautiful, and I was like, wow, those are really beautiful flowers, and she's like, well, I'm getting them for my best friend who got me a ticket to the Sex and the City premiere, and it was so good. She's like, it was so much better than the first one. And I'm thinking, that's pretty low base. But yeah, when I saw, this is a conversation that sort of needs to be had, is Sex and the City. What's fascinating to me about Sex and the City is that it was an HBO series. HBO had no commercial, there was nothing about it, in contrast to most television, that needed to perpetuate consumption. It was not commercially set up to have to do that. It's it's content that you pay for because it's for itself. So the fact that it has become this engine of insane, hyper deranged consumption that really kind of sets so many of the trends of the past 10 years and changed the culture, I think, as a result, at least among women, was always sort of funny and ironic to me. So
that's a very interesting point. That echoes a point that Julia Turner at Slate has been making about the fashion, which is that initially in the HBO series, the fashion was, the thing that we admired is that fashion, insofar as we care about fashion, seemed like a form of self-expression. And so you'd have Carrie kind of eclectically put together outfits which had a certain kind of like delight to them, right? Mm-hmm. Like one thing was drawn from here, and a thing was drawn from a vintage store, and a thing was drawn from there, and a watch from here, and like she really did sort of create a kind of personal self-expression in the way that M.I.A. and Lady Gaga do.
Exactly.
It seemed very much their own thing. And then as the time went on, like particularly in the first Sex and the City movie, it was just labels, right? Like it was just a lot of label whoring.
Right,
like what you were admiring was how expensive the dress was and who made it, right?
It was
that's a totally different ethos.
Well, it's kind of what happens in it's funny because it mirrors what happens in art in New York and kind of like the creative communities a lot. And, there's like it starts as expression. And it ends in an orgy of name dropping and hierarchy, and careerism, and so in that way it was pretty true to life, I guess.
That's interesting.
And it was such a huge vehicle for anyone who's trying to kind of start a label, or promote a label or rehash, whatever. It also made. What was interesting about it, and I think that the reason that it was so compelling was that it made fashion relevant. It made these brands, it made $600 shoes seem like something that people were actually wearing. It made Vogue. I don't think that the fashion industry was nearly as present in the minds of American women before Sex and the City made it seem like it was just a part of life. I never would have thought about Vogue or picked it up if I hadn't had to work for a blog that involved doing that. But they acted as though these things were were part of the natural state of affairs. And so I think that, and it was incredibly, incredibly influential. If you ever watch Real Housewives, I don't know if you ever watched Real Housewives, Anna.
I do watch Real Housewives.
But you know, these are people who are actually living their lives in emulation of Carrie, and to them that means shopping a lot,
right? Right,
and so you know, so anyway,
But do you think it's possible? I mean, so the message got mangled along the way, and you see that even in a slightly different way in this movie, because what happens in this movie is the women are never quite wearing anything that's quite, like, appropriate to the situation, right? Mm-hmm. Like, fashion has actually been sort of divorced from, you know, its original purpose in this movie, which is like, okay, where am I going? What mood am I in? How can I express this sort of, you know, place and mood? Now it's really just completely, like, there's one episode where they go out in the desert, and you know they're dressed like preposterously to get, like they're wearing like really, really high heels, and they look at each other and say like, how can we ride a camel? Like, look at what we're wearing, you know. Whereas you feel like in years past,
right,
like, Carrie would have done something different. But here's the question: is it possible, do you think, to divorce fashion from its commercial element? Like, do you even buy the original notion that, you know, that fashion was a form of self-expression in the first Sex and the City movies? Like, are we creating like a false construct? Is it possible for fashion to serve that role at all?
I think generally, generally fashion as a form of self-expression is pretty weak. I mean, however, I've seen people do it pretty well. I don't think that it's really, but self-expression is self-expression, and so it's just, you know, what the hell are you really expressing? It's right, not a very, right, you know, it's not a very efficient mode for, this is why language was created, you know? I mean, like, decorating right, yourself can only go so far. Basically, right, a lot of looking pretty as a woman is about fitting in and, you know, like, attracting dudes, and you know, people like what looks pretty, but
right,
but so yeah, I didn't, when people say, and this, I heard this over and over again, because I used to rail against fashion a lot on Jezebel, because I just think that it's bad to instill in the youth the sense that this is the ultimate form of self-expression when it is such a, like, limited way of expressing anything.
Right. I also think since the 60s, what's happened is that, you know, because of the effect of the sort of, you know, late 60s on the ad agencies, is what's happened is that's, you know, that's completely the message that any company would, you know, that is what any fashion company, except for sort of haute couture, would,
right. I mean, CNBC,
would sort of use as their message.
CNBC,
you know, I mean, you take like American Apparel, which you've written so interestingly,
as a form of self-expression. You know, so yeah,
right,
I mean, that's just, you know, I'm getting kind of into like baffler territory here, but you know, it is just a big con. I mean, poetry is self-expression. You know, music is a legitimate form of expression.
Right.
Writing, blogging, all those things are
right,
ways that you can do it. You know, building. Art is a form of self-expression, and it's and fashion is just a very, you know, it's not a particularly complex form of art unless you're Lady Gaga, and in as much as it's present in all our lives, it's because we have to wear clothes, and there's a lot of money in that. But
right. Okay, my final thought experiment for you. What if you were able to construct a fashion completely divorced from commercialism? Like, if you said, okay, I, Mo, am going to dress in borrowed clothes for the next 2 years, you know, the way that woman did the Uniform Project or whatever, wearing the same black dress, you know, etc., with accessories. Like, you know, could you make that a form of art?
You know, I think that it's not my medium. I've never been really good at dressing. I mean, right. I think so in as much as, like, well,
right,
when I was in high school, like, I think that also what it was a reaction to kind of cheap, awful, Bangladeshi made mass merchandise clothing, and people had enough.
Right.
I mean, and so the idea that somehow there was some thought and some ingenuity and uniqueness coming back into fashion was only natural, because I remember in high school the only places I would ever shop were Goodwill, and that part of it was because it was cheap, and part of it was because the clothes were more interesting than anything that was at Abercrombie and Fitch, and you know, it's a great way of self-expression when you're a teenager and you're trying to make out with someone, you know. Yeah, I think that fashion is interesting. It's not my medium, though. My favorite, there's this book, Pattern Recognition, about this cool hunter, and who's allergic to fashion, and it's by William Gibson, and she only wears black, white, and gray, and you know, shaves she cuts the labels off everything. She sands down the Levi's imprint in her jeans button. She's really kind of, you know, OCD about banning labels and brands from her life. And I read the book and I started dressing like that, basically.
What's the book called?
Pattern Recognition by William Gibson. I actually wrote it. This, you know, a lot of people who read the book actually sort of started doing that. And so that's sort of still how I dress. Although I recently purchased something that was purple. So I'm reintroducing color
something
in my life.
That was purple.
But one thing that I think about Sex and the City, and this is what I'm wondering, because I'm, you know, reading these reviews, and it's almost like nothing that is panned this way, nothing that sounds this bad could possibly be for real, right? And I often give people too much credit, but my reaction to the first Sex and the City movie, coming on the heels of my sister writing this sort of Marxist critique of it, which I found really funny, on Jezebel, was when I saw it, I was like, this is, you know, a call for class struggle, right? I mean, this movie is trying to incite some sort of revolution. How could anyone read it? How could anyone watch this movie and not want to, you know, to like barf on what the culture has generated? Now,
well, Mo, there's like a perfect Mo line in this movie because, and you and your sister should go see it together, because there's a line when they're sort of sitting around and they're like, you know, somebody offers them that Samantha gets offered the junket to Abu Dhabi, and she's trying to convince the girls to go with her, and she says something like, you know, screw this bad economy, like screw this, like I want some decadence, like let's go to Abu Dhabi, and then start the sort of usual Orientalist jokes like magic carpets, you know, with the double entendre. It's just like, it is intended to incite a revolution, or as you said, like, you know, on your Twitter feed, like, you know, it's like an Al-Qaeda recruitment video, really.
Yeah.
It truly, truly is, especially the sexual liberation part, because it's like, okay, really, like, we all understand it's, like, oppressive in the Middle East, but really, like, you're going to walk around the market with your bra strap showing and, like, you know, your little, you know, tight shorts when you're in your 50s, like, it is pushing it, you know?
Well, right, and I think that maybe that, you know, the Middle East is, like, the very wealthy oil states are the last place where that's really the feminist battle. You know, like that's really what feminists have to achieve. Where else? I mean, one of the things that I think that you know, one of my big takeaways from the crisis was always that, like, if women were in more positions of power, if people had paid attention to women, if Tim Geithner wasn't a sexist, and if Larry Summers wasn't a sexist, Bob Rubin wasn't sexist, we wouldn't be here. You know, there were a lot of women in positions, you know, throughout Wall Street and Washington, where they were trying to, you know, they saw what was coming, and it was sort of like the macho groupthink of the males that prevented derivatives from getting regulated, for instance. And so I do think that, you know, now, and I think that that's kind of clear. I think that people understand that, and you know, I've been writing about this development economist who, you know, basically one of her big things is just trying to make women more economically empowered in countries is actually the way that she's trying to, chip away at the poverty problem. And I think that they make better economic decisions that are better for the communities, and they than men. Not to just bash men, but there's this great Marx quote from his letters to Engels that sort of like social progress is impossible without the liberation of the fair sex, the ugly ones included. And it's sort of like, I think of feminism as having a lot of real economic, as being mostly at this point an economic struggle, and not about, sexual liberation is just I think a really small. It's important in countries where they still practice honor killings, and obviously there's a whole lot of sexual repression that that is pervasive throughout the world and in this country. But I think that I almost think that it's a distraction. I don't know. I could be wrong.
No, that's a good point. It's a distraction.
If you look at Lady Gaga, she grew up just like me, going to Catholic school, and that was the other great part of the Barbara Walters interview, because she was saying, like, well, what does your father think of you having sex with women, and she's like, let me tell you, my dad was horrified, but we're on good terms now, and I've made it through, and I've tried to explain to him that this is my sort of that I'm sort of on my path of of self discovery, and whatever. She actually was a lot more articulate than I am. But I think that that is not as hard, and I think that generally sexual liberation outside the Gulf states comes almost naturally with economic with
liberation,
with economic liberation, with the rise in standards of living, and sort of a rise across the board in standards of living, which is to say, like, huge disparities, huge demographic disparities, like you've got in China or New York, are not going to be good. But if you have a sort of, if you achieve kind of a more economic advancement, I think is sort of the key issue. And so the idea that that the rich Gulf states, where women still have to hide their designer clothes under chadors and hijabs, is the last place where that sort of really kind of superficial and vacuous form of feminism holds.
Right. Right. Well, you know what? Let's end this by making a future date, because I just wrote an Atlantic piece which should come out in a couple weeks, which is about the global economy becoming more amenable to women and what that means, and sort of what that means for feminism and lots of different things.
Oh, wow!
And I think, you will be the perfect person to talk to me about.